this is an actual passport. It's my passport. And for the younger ones who don't know what that is, in this little book, I have information. It has my picture, has my social security number, various numbers and all, my date of birth and everything else. With this book, I can go into any part of the world, any foreign country, and enter it. Without it, I can't get in because there's borders and boundaries and gates and all that. You just can't walk in. Not correctly. So now this is very powerful. Jesus gives us a bit of information that should be in your passport, so to speak, to be able to enter the kingdom of heaven, to be able to get into God's boundaries, his borders, his place, his country. Of course, there's a heavenly country later, and if you have that passport, you'll be able to enter into the kingdom of heaven. You'll actually enter into heaven, but even now you can get into his foreign country. It's a foreign country on earth. It's God's kingdom on earth. Very cool. Now, really, Jesus is my passport. If you've got Jesus, buddy, you've got it. Young lady, you've got it. If you get Jesus in your life and you're following him, he's your real passport. However, to be able to get Jesus, you have to qualify. You have to do certain things. You have to change. You have to become what he wants you to become. And he gives you information in this lesson right here in Matthew chapter 18. We're starting Matthew chapter 18 right now, the verses 1 through 4. And in these verses, he starts explaining how you can get into it. Okay, now this is really interesting how this came about. So we have these disciples. See, I've got 12 of them right here. All of them are here. And they're traveling all over the place. They're moving around. Now, if you remember, they were up north. Like, picture that map right up there. And they were at Caesarea Philippi and by Mount Hermon and in that area. And so they were coming south and they were coming to the east and they were coming down more and more. And as they were coming closer to the town of Capernaum by the Sea of Galilee, they were coming back into Galilee. They had been up there for like weeks and all, maybe some months, maybe a couple, 2-3 months. They hung out and Jesus was teaching them so much. Ooh, I wish I could have sat there and listened to his teachings. Someday I want him to tell me everything he said when I sit up in heaven with him. But anyway, so they're coming and then just something started happening among them. They started talking about like, what about this? What about that? And they started arguing. These are men, but, people make mistakes. I do too. And they start arguing and all. And what the question started happening of who's going to be the greatest in this kingdom, And some of them started thinking, maybe it's me. Maybe it's me. Maybe it's you. Maybe they like this. Started arguing about it. Now, what's really cool, there's so much cool stuff about Jesus. I don't think he overheard it. I really don't think he overheard the conversations. They're kind of walking, along, and they're maybe in the back. Usually disciples followed. They usually don't walk right alongside. Of course, Jesus is different. He probably hung out with them. Come on up here. But at this time, he didn't hear it. But the Spirit of God in Jesus, because God knows everything, and he was human, but the Spirit of God in Jesus showed him all sorts of stuff, and he knew what they were talking about. But he let him go ahead and argue. Now, when he entered into the house, and I believe it's Peter's house. Who knows? It could have been another one that was hospitable, hospitality, let him in there. And Peter's house was there. They're visiting their wife. He was visiting his wife. I don't know, maybe his wife, and maybe he had a family came along with him. But I don't know. Anyway, he was in the house, and then he asked them, even though he knew he wanted to test them and see what they would say. He asked them, hey, fellas. Well, he didn't say, hey, fellas, but he said, what were you talking about, along the way? Got real quiet. No one wanted to say anything because, what, I think they kind of felt, well, this is embarrassing, like who's going to be the greatest? And they were arguing about it, like who it was. By the way, where did that question come up from? I mean, what caused them to even think about that? I think if you go back in the stories right here, if you go back a little bit, things were happening among them. Now, if you remember, Peter was the guy. Peter, I think, is probably a big conversation piece. Well, look at Peter, some jealousy, maybe a little pride, a little ambition. So what was happening? So Peter back here, if you remember, Jesus said, Peter said, sorry, who do you say that I am? Jesus said, Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Blessed are you, Peter. The Father has revealed this to you. Not flesh and blood, no human revealed it, if you remember. And he says, upon this rock, upon you, partially, I'm going to build my church upon not only what you said, your confession, but also you're going to be a key factor. And if you remember in my lesson, in the teaching later on, he's the one that preaches to the Jews and the Gentiles. It's like he's sort of the person who had the keys. He said, I give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And he's the one that actually introduced the gospel to thousands of people, the Jews and the Gentiles. Acts 2 and Acts 10. We'll get to those stories later. Cool stories. But Peter's a kind of a big part here. And so maybe they were going, look at Peter. Of course, they were all very important, and you're very important too, by the way, and I'm very important to God. Very cool. But anyway, let's go on. Then what happened is, you remember, Jesus chose 3. 1, 2, 3. Do you remember who they were to go on that mountain, that high mountain? When they were way up there, Jesus, remember that big word, transfigured. He was changed, is what that means. And it's the actual word like metamorphosis, like from a caterpillar to a butterfly, although he didn't turn into a butterfly. But it was God, he's God in human flesh. And I think at that moment, God and the Father and the Son decided to reveal who he was on the inside. And that means God's light, his power, his presence, and everything shone through his human skin, his flesh. And you could see this brilliant light and everything. Wow. And Jesus, remember, Father said, this is my beloved Son. This is like a higher level than just human. And so he was divine. Very, very powerful. But Peter, James, and John were the ones that God chose, as they chose. So I think they're kind of, who's going to be the greatest? So it might be me. And then remember Peter again, poor Peter. Peter, if you remember, then the last story, or recent story right here, was the last story actually, in chapter 17. And remember the coin in the mouth of the fish? And God, through Jesus, chose to give that special miracle for Peter again. So Peter. So I think he was definitely part of this equation, this situation of jealousy. And they were starting, who is the king? Who is the greatest? Maybe the others were saying, well, you remember they were going through the 204 villages in Galilee, and they were healing people and delivering. Well, I saw this one miracle God used through me. I don't know. We don't know exactly, but they were jealous, and the jealousy. Plus, they were thinking, and this is a major point here, they're all thinking, wait, Jesus is going to set up his kingdom, which he already was, in these guys and others as other disciples, that the Spirit was really working in their lives, and he was changing them, and he was using his name and all that to deliver people, and all Jesus was really delivering. The kingdom of God was already pushing back the powers and the kingdom of darkness and of Satan. But anyway, they said, well, when he sets up his kingdom, thinking it's going to be a physical kingdom, like he's going to have an actual crown and he's going to be sitting on a throne, what about us? And then if we're going to sit like maybe with him as princes under his command, and then we get to command others and have authority over others, then what about us, and then we're going to be dignitaries and high officials and all that. Then they say, yeah, but who's going to be the top one? And there's where the argument comes in. Who's the greatest? And so what happened is they got all quiet, remember, when he said, what are you talking about? And finally, probably Peter, he opened his mouth a lot. It was bold. But one of them said, they went out with the question. See, I'm putting Matthew, Mark, and Luke together. If you put it together, it fits beautifully. And Matthew writes down, he mentions either the summary of this whole thing, because he's writing it, or it's actually happened like it happened. But one of them said, who's going to be the greatest in the kingdom? Oh, before he did that, by the way, I think Jesus, because he knew this, and Luke it says this, he said, whoever's going to be first, whoever wants to be first and all, is going to be last of all and servant of all. Wait, what? Yeah, you want to be first, you're going to be last. And if you want to be like chief and all, you want to be like really important, you're going to be the servant, the slave, the bond slave of everybody. This is really important for you to get. This is God's kingdom. It's different than the world. The world is like power and position and all this stuff and wealth and money and all that. No. That's not what counts, not what's important. It's the people who serve, who's low and humble. And once he said that, he brought a little child, up and sat him in the midst. He put him right in the middle of all of them. And they're all looking at each other. What's he bringing this child in? Maybe it's Peter's son. Maybe he had his own little son there. Now, it doesn't say child. It says little child. So I think he was maybe a toddler or something. And I'll tell you why, in case I forget. He put him in the middle. He mentioned some stuff. And then it says he put him to his side. Luke says side. Matthew said middle. And then Mark said he actually took him up in his arms. So he didn't take a 8-year-old, or, well, could have if they're small or something, this boy, but 10-year-old, 12-year-old, I don't think so. He had a little child, probably a little toddler, and picked him up. You know how parents pick up, or others, they pick up the kid and they're holding him like this. And he's standing there holding this child, and he said, this is what you got to become like. What? All right, we'll get to that right here in a second, but let's go a little deeper. Stay with me. This is good. All right, so here we have kingdom. Jesus has been talking about kingdom, remember, from jump, all the way from the beginning. He kept talking about the kingdom, kingdom. And then he said, and this is our question, who is the greatest of this, like, kingdom? Okay, that's what their question is. And then the second answer is what I'm going to do. But do you remember a time in our studies? And boy, if you remember this, good for you. That's pretty amazing. But do you remember a time in our studies where he actually already said who's going to be the greatest? You happen to remember that? He said in Matthew chapter 5. Yeah, really cool. He said, whoever obeys keeps the least of the commandments. Want the best at obeying, like, you obey everything. Look, if you want to be really pleasing God, and you want to be among the greatest, I don't like the idea of saying I want to be the greatest, but I want to be very pleasing to God, but you end up becoming the greatest possibly, and that's not your purpose for it. But if you're obeying Jesus to please him, and you're obeying your mom, your dad, and you're obeying authorities, and you're obeying your teachers, and you're obeying God and everything, oh my goodness, you're obeying all the commandments, not just pick and choose, which ones. You're obeying everything that you know to do. Woo, you are on it. And you're going to be among the greatest. And the ones who kind of do it here and there, and they're not really working at it real hard, they're going to be the least. They're not as worthy of the rewards that God wants to give. And this is a story that we're on right now, too. And this is what he said. He said he took a child, and he said, to be able to be the greatest in the kingdom, he said, you've got to become like little children. What? This is the lesson for today. Okay, so again, well, this is what he actually said. Whoever, except you be converted. He said, unless you be converted. Now that word converted means to change. Or another word is like to turn. Unless you turn, like you turn. Think of it as like a convertible, like this car right here. See this car? Now, this is not one of these cars that I can actually, they have a convertible, a real car. You know what a convertible is, right? During the summer, you put down the roof and put it back here, and then you're driving around. And then in the winter, you put it up. It converts. It turns. It changes. Unless you convert, except you convert and become as little children, Jesus said, you will not even enter the kingdom of heaven. Wow. So wait a minute, you have to become like a little child. Now, if you're a little child, you already got a lot of this stuff, because it's not like every child. Some children are spoiled. Ooh, they get everything they want, and they're mean and they're nasty. But there's some really wonderful children. Hopefully, if you're a child, you're one of those really good little kids here. And he said, unless you become like little children, you're not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so here's kind of some human beings here, let's say, my little stick figures. And you've got a little child, maybe 3 or 4 or whatever. Then you've got a, 8, 10, 11, 12-year-old, whatever. Then you have a teenager, and then you have the adult. Jesus is talking to adults here. He's talking to the men, and he's going to answer the question, who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? Okay. And then what he does, he says, unless you change, turn, and become like this little child. So you have to become like that, okay, to be able to become a part of my kingdom, to be able to enter. You will never enter the kingdom of heaven unless you become like a little child. Wow. Now, let's talk a little bit more about that. It could be, a lot that we could think about and try and figure this out. But I want to say a little bit of what I know about what it was like in that day. Children, as a part of the whole world, were very important to their parents. Most parents really love their kids. Of course, the thing is, a lot of times, some of the parents of some of the countries didn't get real close to their kids. Isn't that sad? Because they died at birth, a lot of them. So they didn't want to have this emotional, or not just at birth, there's little infants and all. There's a lot of what's called immortality. They died a lot because they didn't have hospitals, they didn't have doctors, they have sanitation, they have the knowledge that we have of germs and all that. They didn't have all that, so they didn't know what to do, and they were dying a lot. So it was really easy to die in that time. Aren't you kind of glad that you're living in this time? You can actually have more knowledge and doctors and all that. Anyway, so they didn't really get emotionally attached, a lot of them. But a lot of these parents, of course, love their kids, but still, it was adults up here and kids down here. And a lot of times it was men and then women and then children, or women and children about here. It depends on the nation and the culture and all that, what it was like. So children in that time did not have the rights or the privileges like our children do in our country and our era in this age. Children have more priority. And maybe it was the gospel of Jesus that changed that. In my opinion, the gospel that Jesus gave us, and how he lived and how he acted with people changed women's status and men and, well, I mean, children and all that. So I think there's value. Jesus values children. And I'm going to tell you right now, there's nothing, this in this statement, I've said this for years, there's nothing more important to God than kids. Wow. There isn't. I mean, everyone's important to him, don't get me wrong, but boy, I'll tell you what, they're right up there, tip top, very important to him, because God realizes they're helpless, and they could be, you know, they can't change things like men and women can. They can't leave if things are bad and all that. They have to stay where they are. And wow, it's really hard. So God's heart is huge for kids. Huge. God really loves kids. And if you read through the Old Testament, through the New, all of it, all the way across, whoo, he's very, very concerned about kids. And the next chapter, by the way, we're going to go deeper into that. It's really good. Let me go on. So you have to become like a little child. They're lower ranked, and they weren't as important. And the disciples were kind of flipping out at this time, like, whoa, that is so different than the world around us. See, the world around them, even today, it's like this. The world around them thinks this is important, power. Well, kids don't have power. They can't even make decisions. They have no power to make big, important decisions on that. A lot of times they don't understand. They have to grow and learn. But they're like powerless, totally. And Jesus said, you got to become like this. He said, in that day and age, and even nowadays, people want power. You want power, you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. If you want to be like powerful and ruling and all that, not good. And position is what was important to them. This is a position of a child, low position, okay, weak position. Prosperity, money, okay, wealth. Whoever's looking for power, position, and wealth, I'm afraid you're not going to enter the kingdom of heaven. You have to become like a little child to be able to enter the kingdom of heaven. Popularity, okay, whoever's trying to be real popular. By the way, the disciples became popular, but they weren't trying to become popular. That's the point. You can get in a position of power and maybe make a lot of money and all that, but you're not trying to do it. You're not going after it. So little children don't go after all that, you know. Popularity, praise, people who wants to be praised all the time, like me, look at me, not good. Miss Personality or Mr. Personality, I don't care what type of personality I have. You might be a comic, you might be hilarious, you might be smart, might be really awesome child and adult, but that's not going to get you in the kingdom of heaven. You have to humble yourself, and there's the key word. Don't forget it, humble. Humble. Right there, that's the key word, humble. And by the way, Jesus goes on and says in the next verse, whoever humbles himself and becomes like this little child shall be called greatest in the kingdom. Now he's answering the question. So now this little child hopefully wasn't some spoiled brat and all, but you know, there's just certain kids you can tell, and they're really sweet and they're kind and they're, can I help you, mommy? You know, can I help you, daddy? They're really giving, and really, that's the type of child. So he said, you have to become like this little child. There's your model. There's your example. Those are the people who are going to be greatest in the kingdom of heaven. This is great stuff. All right, so we have praise, personality, perfect, Miss Perfect or Mr. Perfect, thinking you're all that. Miss Pretty or Mr. Handsome, you know, thinking maybe you're really very good looking, you're so beautiful and all that, but the problem is that's not going to cut it. That's not going to get you into heaven. And people are trying to get all pretty and trying to get, change themselves and all that. Oh my goodness, this is not important, none of this. This is not going to enter you here, and that's what counts. And then proud, the people are proud and stuck up and think they know it all. And the big word is primacy. Primacy means first. First. See, that is what you don't want to become. Remember, Jesus said, whoever is going to be first is going to be last of all. You get last in line. Take the last piece of cake. Don't let everyone else have first. Let others have their preference. The Bible says preferring one another. And it says, consider others more important than yourself. See, more important. See, the children in that day weren't as important. Yet to God and his economy and his kingdom, yeah, baby. That's the government of God right there. Okay, so you have to become, and if you're a child, you're on your way already. You have to become like a little child to be able to enter the kingdom. My drawings. Okay, I can't. There you go. Close enough. You have to become a child. Now, what does that mean? Let's end this. Jesus said you have to become like a child. What does that mean? Well, let's say least important. You don't consider yourself all that. Although you're very important to God, remember. Keep that in mind. You're valuable to God. Okay. So valuable that he picked up a kid and said, you got to become like this kid. I love it. See, the rank is down here. It's least, not first. It's this one. The underdog, the person who's less than other people in the people's minds and the world's minds. 2, you have to be last. Least, last. Okay, right there, least and last. And that means, maybe you're the last one to be picked on a team, or you're going to play a game of baseball or basketball or whatever. You're the last one. God looks at that, And let's say you actually deliberately want to be last. No, pick him first. Let him have first. Whew, boy, is that valuable to God. And so the disciples were thinking, hey, we're going to be the chiefs. We're going to be up here. He said, you got the wrong thinking, you guys. You're thinking of who's the greatest. You should be thinking on how can you serve? How can you be the last of all and the least of all? And the third one I put is lowly. The children had a humble position in society. Their status, their rank, their level, their status, they're like down here at the bottom. And they weren't the bottom, and slaves were too, servants and slaves were there. But little child, this is what is so powerful about the kingdom of heaven, what God's kingdom is like. And so what a lesson that these guys experienced. By the way, these guys ended up becoming very popular, and they actually influenced a lot of people. They had power of God working in them. They lost a lot of their reputation and their position with the world and the church and all that. I mean, the synagogues and the Jewish people and all that. But you know what? They became great. Guess what they ended up having? Jesus says, and we'll find this out in these Gospels, is that they're going to be ruling on 12 thrones with God, with Jesus. But they wouldn't have done it if they would have said, we want it. They would have lost it. Instead, they decided to serve people and humanity and love people and all that. They ended up getting on 12 thrones. And you know what? The Bible says in the book of Revelation that the city that God's going to build right here has 12 foundations. 12. Guess what those 12 foundations are called? The apostles. And probably Paul's in there. Or maybe Matthias, really. But later, because one of them betrayed Jesus, Judas, he's not in there. But I want you to be in there. And I want you to, number one, enter the kingdom of heaven. You got to become like a child. You're not after power and this and that, trying to get stuff for yourself. You shouldn't even want Jesus to get into heaven, although it's good. You want to get into heaven. But no, I go after Jesus for Jesus. I want him to be happy with me. And that's what it's like a little child. Mommy, can I help you? Daddy, can I serve? Can I help you wash the car? Or whatever. So I hope you got a lot out of this. This is a rich teaching. Full of wealth, full of power, full of insight, deep wisdom. So become like a little child, whatever age you are. You could be 92 or you could be, 6 or whatever. Or a teenager. You got to become like a little child, teen. You got to humble yourself and become like a child. Hope that God gets that for you. Thank you very much for listening. Be blessed.